Good evening and welcome to our first Ramadan event this year. And to those who are fasting, I would say Ramadan Kareem. Our guest, Hadani Ditmars, is a highly distinguished journalist. Her presence in war zones has given her a unique insight not only into the suffering of those who are physically affected by violence, but more importantly, the cultural and moral deterioration that happens in the aftermath of war. She speaks about the oppression on Iraqi soul, a word which we Iraqis understand very well and are very familiar with indeed. She covered Iraq in 2 books, yet the first one between 1997 to 2003, and that book is called Dancing in the No-Fly Zone. In the words of Boyd Tompkin of the London Independent, he says, her book on Iraq touches places in the nation's soul that horror headlines never reaches. Tonight, Hadani is going to shed light on the cultural heritage of Iraq, being the essence and symbol of the Iraqi spirit before and after the invasion, as well as this brutal wave of violence and damaging to the architectural places and monuments, smashing of monuments committed by the gangs. Those are places she has visited and documented very well during her long stays in Iraq. To us and to the rest of the world, it is the smashing of the cradle of civilization, Iraq, where writing was created along with the first code of law, as well as the invention of the wheel and the first musical instrument, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and many other historical achievements. We are proud and privileged to have Hadani as our guest speaker tonight. Please give her a warm welcome. I would like to remind you that due to the fact that we are in Ramadan now, there will be a Ramadan dinner after this, and I think there is some sign of gratitude towards Hadani from the Iraqi Cultural Center. Welcome.
Thank you. Shukrani ktir, Wahida. Thank you for such a lovely introduction. I'm overwhelmed by the hospitality here, which is very typical of Iraqi hospitality. But I also have to say I feel very much at home. This is like Beit al-Iraqi, Ruhi al-Iraqi. And I spent so many years documenting Iraq, its rise and fall and fall and fall, and inshallah its rise again. So it's very special for me to be here tonight. I feel like I'm with friends and with family. And I would just like to start with thank yous for the invitation. Thank you, first of all, Wahida, for such a lovely introduction. Shukran. And thank you to Abdurrahman Dayab. It's so nice to finally meet you in person after our long correspondence. And it was lovely to taste mazgouf in London. That was very important. And I also want to thank Walid and Yasser, who have really done an exceptional job of helping me set all the technical and video and audio systems up tonight. I wish I could hire you away to work with me. We could go on the road together, inshallah. Also Isan Al-Imam is going to be playing some oud for us later tonight, and I have the pleasure of being reacquainted with him after we met in 2009 or 2008, when I was doing a documentary that you can listen to on my website about the Iraqi artists in exile in London with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. CBC. So you can hear imams playing online as well. Lovely to see you again, and your daughter, who's now so grown up. And thank you to my friends. I have some Canadian friends here tonight and some Iraqi friends and some very distinguished Iraqi guests. I'm really honored that the great Iraqi writer Khaled Al-Kushtini is here. And also Hassan Abdurazak is here, the Iraqi playwright. And my friends from Canada, Helen and Deborah and everyone, welcome. So I'm going to try and not be too depressing tonight in my presentation, but what I thought I would do would be to show you a little bit of the work I've been doing since 1997 in Iraq, which is kind of a chronicle of the state of culture in Iraq, and in a larger sense, the state of Iraq and the state of the Ruh Iraqiye. So, before I begin, I think I'm going to read you something that I just had published today in the Middle East Eye about the current situation, and I also want to just say Ramadan Kareem to those who are fasting, and I'm sorry that I'm going to have to be drinking water in front of you. I'm not as stoic as many of the people fasting here tonight. So I'd just like to say also that I would like to dedicate my presentation tonight to the widows and the orphans in Iraq, who are really the true inheritors of the jihad. I mean, their daily life is a struggle, and I'm always so struck by the strength, especially of the Iraqi women, many of whom are alone and widowed and raising their families in very difficult situations. So, Inshallah al-Salam in Iraq. So I'm going to start with reading this latest column that I wrote in the Middle East Eye, which you can read online. Middle East Eye is a new website that David Hurst, formerly of The Guardian, has started with Ramzi Baroud. And I'm sorry that my Arabic isn't good enough to just translate this spontaneously. أنا كندية بس ستي من لبنان. So Lebanese, 100 years ago they came to Canada, and I'm trying to learn Arabic now, شوية شوية. The latest in the surrealist horror show that the nightly news on Iraq has become offers a rich narrative, at least for a writer working on a political travelogue of ancient sites. Once again, the Mongol hordes are at the gates, and they have mobile phones. After destroying statues of a poet and a musician in Mosul, ISIS now threatens to destroy the 2nd century BC city of Hatra, and UNESCO has sounded the alarm about one of their World Heritage Sites at risk. The Director General of UNESCO, Irina Bokova, said earlier this week, "I call on all actors to refrain from any form of destruction of cultural heritage, including religious sites. Their intentional destruction are war crimes and a blow against the Iraqi people's identity and history." In one of many ironies, this well-preserved example of a Parthian city that has survived centuries of imperial intrigue and invasions may fall victim to a group of angry yet well-organized and funded young men, drunk on brutality, wired on ideology run amok, galvanized by decades of war and injustice. Hatra has more recently served as a film set for the 1973 production of The Exorcist, in which a priest discovers a talisman belonging to an ancient demon and brings it back to the US, where it possesses a young American girl. Well, it's not difficult to ascertain that the disastrous invasion of 2003 has unleashed more than its fair share of vindictive spirits, of which ISIS is only one. Iraq's ancient sites, as its people, have been long suffering. Iraq's monuments bear witness to and share in the hardships of her people. After years of war and occupation, historic sites have been badly damaged and neglected. While the Taliban's destruction of the Buddhas of Bamyan in Afghanistan was universally condemned, outrage about the destruction of Iraqi and indeed world heritage, not to mention the fate of Iraq's people, has been somewhat restrained. As Muwafiq al-Tayyi, who was an architect under Saddam but an unrepentant communist who was simultaneously lionized and spied upon by the Ancien regime and then almost killed by US troops after the invasion, and my erstwhile travel companion on my journey to Iraq's ancient sites, as he always says, you have to understand the past to make sense of the present. I was inspired to write my next book, Ancient Heart, when Muwafiq took me on a tour of sacred sites in Baghdad, in the midst of sectarian war zones, garbage dumps, and displaced people's camps. It reminded me of the last scene in Planet of the Apes, when Charlton Heston sees the Statue of Liberty half submerged on the beach. You know that scene?
Yeah.
As I write this, I am looking at a map of ancient sites in Iraq. Most maps of Iraq in the popular imagination are divided into 3 neat sectarian sections or filled with bullet point punctuations on the evening news. I am convinced of the power of this map. If applied correctly, it may just transform people's consciousness. I want people to see Iraq for what it is, whether American generals or ISIS commanders, to recognize the depth and soul of the land they invaded, not just as another terrorized place to be abandoned, but as part of our world heritage. My map shows Ur, the birthplace of the prophet Abraham and the home of the Sumerian Ziggurat. It was once a temple to the moon god Nana, and many moons later, its adjoining town of Nasiriyah, site of the Shia uprising, encouraged by George Bush Sr. and then brutally repressed by the regime while the US stood by. Here, the Iraqi Communist Party was founded in 1932, and an important Jewish community existed until 1951. Fierce battles took place during the 2003 invasion, and Nasiriyah's 15 minutes of fame occurred when US Private Jessica Lynch became a POW there. No one mentioned the ruins. Or consider Kirkuk, for example, which stands on the site of the ancient Assyrian capital of Arafah, located near the Khasa River on the ruins of a 5,000-year-old settlement, the Kirkuk citadel. Arafah was an important city under the Assyrians in the 10th and 11th centuries BC, and because of its strategic geographical location, it became the battleground for 3 empires, Assyria, Babylonia, and Media. Today, Kirkuk, with ISIS at the gates, is a tinderbox of sectarian conflict as Kurds, Arabs, and Turkomans duke it out for control of the city and its vast oil resources. By June 2007, 18 ancient shrines had been lost in and around Kirkuk. My map also shows the ancient site of Babylon, then damaged and severely contaminated by US-led forces post-invasion when they turned the site into a military depot. Today, Babylon boasts an oil pipeline and a displaced persons camp. But there is also a shrine there to one of the sons of Imam Ali. The local women come to pray here for fertility because underneath the Islamic shrine lies one to Marduk, supreme god of Babylon. Iraqis of all faiths I met still wear his likeness as talisman pendants and even pray to him for intercession. I'll tell you a story later about Marduk, and I think he helped me get my visa the last time I went to Iraq. He made a little shrine in my living room. It's an interesting story. And so Iraq, where language and architecture were invented and a robust modern culture flourished and still struggles to survive, is now a country of widows and orphans, of angry young men and their rival militias. But its ancient sites, who have witnessed so many empires come and go, should unite Iraqis in their moment of crisis, not divide them. They are a reminder that long before the British or the Americans, long before ISIS or the Ba'ath Party, there was Uruk. Before there were Muslims or Christians, Sunni or Shia, Arabs or Kurds, there was Mesopotamia. And there is a power in that, and as I wish with all my heart, a glimmer of hope amidst the madness. Shukran. So I wrote that in my friend Miranda's garden suite on the weekend. I hope you received it in the right way. And inshallah al-salam in Iraq. I'm going to try and read my script without my glasses, which is like superhuman feat, but I'll keep them here just in case. So, and this little thing will disappear at the bottom as soon as I move it. This is a photo I took in Baghdad of a young Iraqi boy who was as old as the invasion. This is from 2010. He's wearing a map of his homeland pinned close to his heart there. And his eyes really speak volumes. This turned out to be the cover photo for the special issue I did on Iraq for the New Internationalist, which you can find on my website and online. I went back in 2010 after having been there in 2003 in the fall to do my first book. So I'm just going to give you a presentation about my sort of history in Iraq and the cultural scene. When I went to Baghdad in 2000 to write about architecture for Wallpaper magazine, most people were not terribly concerned with Iraq, with its architecture, or with its long-suffering people, for that matter. They weren't concerned that 500,000 children had died due to draconian sanctions that would not allow chlorine for water purification into a desert country, destroyed what was left of the Arab world's best public health and education system, and entrenched Saddam's power. They didn't know or care that there was Bauhaus in Baghdad, that architecture had been invented in the land where Abraham was born, or that the cradle of civilization had a proud modern history of literature, public art, and theater. That in the 1970s, newly nationalized oil industry funds had been put into programs to build cultural institutions and eliminate illiteracy, or that half the doctors and half the public service in Iraq were women. Indeed, Iraq, a country of some 30 million then, of men and women, Arabs and Kurds, Christians and Muslims, was reduced to caricature, an empty land of terror populated only by Saddam, yet another leader of a client state turned pariah, and his Republican Guard. But the Baghdad I knew was one of dark musical comedy, clandestine galleries, and artists who dared to resist both the excesses of a police state and the deprivation of a 12-year embargo. And now, as another anniversary of the invasion draws near, or just happened, as it were, the very fabric of Iraq's cultural being is under threat. Over a decade later, Iraq is a country of widows and orphans, of sectarian militias and flagging infrastructure, a shadow of its former self. 3 decades of war, sanctions, and despotism have taken their toll. And I'd just like to show you a clip of me talking about the special issue I wrote and photographed on Iraq and the legacy of invasion when I was an editor at New Internationalist magazine in 2010. So now I just go like this with 4 fingers and slide over, and I'll get to this. Oh, it worked. Okay. And then I just press full screen. And these are just photos here. You'll see everything should be synced up.
The US and the UK are keen to see democracy take root in Iraq so as to justify their illegal invasion and occupation. In fact, there's a humanitarian disaster unfolding. When I went back to Iraq this time, for the first time in 7 years, I was really saddened to see how broken the country was. At the same time that there was this great sense of despair at what Iraq had become post-invasion, I did come away with a sense of hope.
That's me in 1998.
And the artists and the young people, and some of the women I spoke to who have really borne the brunt of years of sanctions and war and occupation. Their spirit of resilience and survival was quite inspiring. But as for the future of Iraq, it's a long road to recovery. This is a country that has seen its civil society battered by 12 years of draconian UN sanctions, exacerbated by despotism and Saddam's police state, followed by brutal invasion and occupation. 70% of Iraqis don't have clean drinking water. There's at least 70% unemployment, 1 million widows, an army of orphans. Until the needs, the basic human needs of those people, of this growing army of the displaced and the dispossessed, until their needs are met, there'll be no peace in Iraq. It's that simple.
Okay, it worked. Thank you, technical team. So those were a collection of photos that were put together by a filmmaker who interviewed me. And the Down America one, you may have noticed. I always find that really interesting because that was, I took it, you know, in the old days, there were minders. It was a sort of Soviet-style thing. So I was one of the very few Western journalists that would go to Iraq. And you know, I wrote the first story for the New York Times in 1997 about the humanitarian costs of the sanctions. But the minders, they never wanted to have Hadani as their person to mind because I was a lot of trouble and I would take photos of things I wasn't supposed to. So I snuck that photo as we were driving past an elementary school. I think it was in El Mansour. And it's interesting to see it now because, you know, you see the little girl in her school uniform. She's not wearing hijab. She's studying. Hasn't been pulled out for early marriage or, you know, she's going to school with boys. That really is kind of a time capsule photo now. And then there was a photo of me in 1998 with a crowd of children that you may have noticed. And the children were all smiling and happy. And I was a lot younger then in 1998, so you may not have recognized me. But the interesting thing about that, if you compare that photo with the photo of the boy I showed you, the boy who has the adult eyes, who's as old as the invasion, those children were happy because they had been let out of school, because that was during the 1998 bombing campaign instigated by Clinton called Desert Fox, which you may remember he used to distract the world from the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And I was walking around Karada, interviewing survivors of the bombing. And the children were just really happy to not have to go to school. And I just compare that photo with, you know, the 2010 image of the boy who just looks like he's carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. So in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, when I returned to research my book, Dancing in the No-Fly Zone, there were hundreds of American journalists that literally rode in on the back of a tank, but very few architects. There were many journalists from America coming in literally with the military, but not very many architects. And compare this to the mid-century visits of Frank Lloyd Wright and others. There was actually recently a show at the New York Center for Architecture called Baghdad City of Mirage, from Wright to Venturi, which documented all the modernist projects that happened in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. So you can also consider Vancouver-born Arthur Erickson's plan for Abu Nawas. I'm from Vancouver. A district in Baghdad in the late 70s, when Iraq had the best public health and education system and the highest status of women in the Arab world. In fact, I always felt something vaguely Babylonian about Erickson's work. I understood it best when I went to Baghdad. It was sort of a simple water element in the garden of the Al Rashid Hotel that struck me, a certain resonance that bridged the ancient and modern. And I saw some of the hanging gardens of Babylon in his Robson Square courthouse. So I'm just going to advance this. This is his courthouse in Vancouver. You can sort of see what I'm talking about. Also, I interviewed some Iraqi Christian refugees in my city, in Vancouver, a few years ago, who had to flee when their church was firebombed by militias. And they ended up in a suburb of Vancouver that was very generic. But I said, is there anything familiar to you about this place? And they said, well, yes, when we went to Robson Square, to this complex that Arthur Erickson designed, it reminded us of Baghdad. In the homage for The Guardian that I wrote when Arthur Erickson passed away in 2009, I wondered what Baghdad would have become if that Abu Nawas project had been realized. If there had been no Iran war that foiled it, or no invasion of Kuwait sparked by war debts after that crippling 8-year conflict. The death of the Ericsson project was actually emblematic of a more general cultural shift in Iraq when cultural funds were drained for the war chest and the beginning of a 3-decade decline. In Iraq, there's always been nostalgia for some golden age, imagined or real, for the Abbasid era, and Harun al-Rashid. After the invasion, when I went to Iraq, there seemed to be a brief nostalgia for the monarchy. But when I was there in 2010, many people longed for the days of Abdul Karim Qasim. One old man in the market told me, we had jobs then and security. Jobs and security. It seems like not so much to ask for, but it is today. The students at the Fine Arts Academy in Baghdad I met in 2010 were nostalgic for the early 60s fervor of communist nationalist poets like Mudaffar al-Nawab. And later I'm going to show you a video clip of the play they performed about his life, which I was only able to film under extreme duress. The first time I missed the performance because it took 3 hours to drive to the theater. The second time I left 4 hours early and I got there through the traffic and I filmed some of it. But first I'd like to read you this introduction to a tourist brochure that I found in Baghdad in the 90s. It's from A Tourist Guide to Iraqi Antiquities, and it's published in 1972 by Jumhuriya Press when Hassan al-Bakr was the president of the Republic. And it's called Baghdad, City of Peace. The city of Baghdad has been famous since its establishment by the Abbasid Caliph Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, who ordered the building of the celebrated Round City in the spring of 762 AD on the right bank of the Tigris. The planning of this city is considered by researchers as the ideal example of urbanism and is indeed a superb evidence of Arab achievement. This is not me, this is the tourist guide. Later, Abbasid caliphs and emirs competed in enlarging and developing Baghdad by building luxurious palaces and parks, impressive edifices such as mosques, hostels, schools, and intellectual centers, which remain for centuries the focus of world learning. This part is interesting. Various dark periods have overrun Baghdad, and it was diminished considerably through repeated coups and civil wars. Consequently, all the institutions were badly neglected, and daily life was almost paralyzed. Sieges and wars by foreign nomadic hordes who had no cultural understanding added much to the calamities. They talk about the Mongols destroying the libraries, and they say, but these were not the last invasions in the long history of the city. Later attacks and counterattacks by rival governors and rulers who attained supremacy in Baghdad, from the Safavids to the Ottomans, each in turn contributed to further devastation of the city's artistic and cultural treasures. Very little remained of the once fabulous Baghdad. I love that they used that word. It's 1972. However, the brave city withstood all those hard days and soon overcame its conquerors who, influenced by the spirit of Arabian culture, all wanted to have Baghdad as the seat of their kingdoms. So again, that was from A Tourist Guide of Iraqi Antiquities, published in 1972. So can you hear me at the back? I hope you're not falling asleep. Hope it's riveting listening. For many of you here, it will be very familiar. And I hope that there are some people who haven't been to Iraq who are learning something about this amazing culture and place. So I'm just going to read you an excerpt from the wallpaper feature that I did in 2000, which you can read on my website. Wallpaper magazine, the British architecture magazine, sent me to Iraq to document modernist architecture. And that was in 2000 when a lot of it was still intact before it was bombed. So this is the cover of it, Carry On Baghdad. You may remember this. Monument. Baghdad, a city whose history spans from the glories of Caliph Harun al-Rashid's reign to the deprivation of a 10-year-old embargo, this was in 2000, is not a place for the casual tourist. This is a city with a serious past and a tenuous future, a place of Abbasid palaces and malnourished children of 1,001 nights in a current sprawling 5,000 square kilometers. To be one of the 5 million people here is to feel the dizzy collision of these simultaneous realities. Of course, you'd never know this from watching CNN. You would imagine Baghdad as a place populated only by Saddam Hussein and Peter Arnett, by the Republican Guard and American television cameramen. You would think of missiles lighting up this night sky and angry Iraqis shouting at rallies. But you wouldn't think of Bauhaus architecture now, would you? In fact, Baghdad's modern architecture is as worthwhile as its more ancient examples, and a quick review of the last 8 or 9 decades tells the story of 20th century Iraq, from the Ottoman-style houses of the early part of the century through to the English-influenced post-World War I, when British troops arrived, the elegant 30s and 40s villas of the monarchist era, when King Faisal reigned, to the post-1958 revolution, public buildings more than a little reminiscent of Stalingrad, to the golden age of the 70s, when oil was nationalized and money grew on palm trees. In the 1980s, the Iran-Iraq War inspired many battle-sized public monuments, but with Desert Storm in 1991 and the impoverishment of a decade of sanctions, construction came to a halt. But this was in 2000. Now, with the smell of money in the air, as thousands of foreign companies descend on Baghdad monthly, hoping for some lucrative government contracts, and the new smuggling class of embargo cats, as the sanctions profiteers are called, working up an appetite for lavish new villas, there is an odd sort of construction boom afoot. Odd because this is still a city with nightly power cuts, an infant mortality rate that has doubled in a decade, and the omnipresent threat of bombardment from American planes. This is a place where the dramatic devaluation of the dinar means that in a country that was once one of the wealthiest in the Middle East, exchanging even 30 or 40 American dollars, the hard currency of choice, now results in a few plastic bags full of Iraqi currency. I still have all these dinars in my boxes. So a place where beyond the basics, medicines for the cancers that have multiplied since the Gulf War bombings left depleted uranium in the soil and water are out of reach for most Iraqis, and where antique shops are full of treasures from old Baghdadi families who have either left or retreated into quiet misery. So I'm going to just read you a little bit more from this. At the gropius designed University of Baghdad, which you have here, architecture department head Dr. Al-Arawi, who trained in the late 60s in London, is shaking his head. I try to tell my students, he begins, what it was like here in the 70s, but they just can't relate to it. This was a time before many of the doctor's students could even talk, when the oil boom meant subsidized education and healthcare, and the government gave young home seekers a free plot of land and building materials. It was a time before 8 years of war with Iran and 10 years of economic struggle, before martyrs and malnutrition. It was a good time, says Al-Arawi, with a slight smile and a glint of nostalgia in his middle-aged eyes. His colleague, Janoun Khadim, a 30-something woman lecturer in the department who has a master's degree in architectural preservation, complains that students today, they have grown up with little education about their heritage. With the embargo also preventing the influx of books, educational materials, and new technology, Khadim says that young people must depend on their elders' knowledge, both to understand their past and to shape their future. This new generation, she explains, they have no connection to history. Khadim, who was born in Kansas and speaks perfect English, relates that on a recent trip she organized for her class to visit the ancient city of Hatra in the north, which is currently under threat from ISIS. Her students were more interested in sleeping in the car than in visiting the ruins. But with the nature of globalization being what it is, they do have great knowledge of Western pop culture. Leonardo DiCaprio remains a constant heartthrob, and Celine Dion belts out the Titanic theme song on Shabab TV, the new channel patronized by President Hussein's son, Uday, more often than would seem healthy. So as a Canadian, I came and I stayed at the Al Rashid, and I turned on Shabab TV, and there was Celine Dion singing the Titanic theme song. It was surreal. Today, Dr. Al-Arawi, a handsome man in his mid-50s, has offered to take us on a tour of the city With its huge square footage and multitude of neighborhoods, Baghdad can be a labyrinth without the right guide. So far, ours has been an affable minder named Kais, a man in his mid-40s who looks much older than Dr. Al-Arawi and with whom our common language is only a broken Spanish. It's like, donde está el monumento? Kais is from the old school of Iraqi minders who never let you photograph anything without written permission in triplicate. Somehow, Iraqi society does manage to be both incredibly chaotic and at the same time bureaucratic. When Al-Arawi and Kais speak together in Arabic, you can hear in their accents and see in the way they move the difference between the old Baghdadi families and the petit bourgeois Baathists who supplanted them in 1963. Now, the power of both classes is gradually being usurped by wealthy sanctions profiteers. But it is thanks to them that Dr. Al-Arawi still has work, apart from his teaching at the university, which, on a state salary in dinars, is practically on a volunteer basis. Predictably, their penchant is for the garish, but Dr. Al-Arawi tries his best in the new cultural jihad between taste and money. They like everything to be brand new, he explains, as we head off in our gleaming white late 70s American car. In sanctions-weary Baghdad, full of run-down old beaters with broken windshields and with spare parts blocked at the border, our Buick is considered a luxury. There it is, that was the Buick, parked outside the Al Rashid. We take a perfunctory cruise past Tahrir or Liberation Square to check out the late Iraqi artist Jawad Salim's monument to liberty. We then go on to Al Rashid Street, where the 20s and 30s style buildings remind me of Lawrence Durrell's Alexandria. Alas, there is no seaside and there are no Justines lingering at the chai houses, only barefoot kids recycling scrap metal they find between crumbling buildings. We wander through the old bazaar where carpet sellers practice their best English phrases. Lady, come and see, only look, only look, only look. And semi-wild mongrels prowl the winding alleys where Sufi shrines meet antique jewelry shops. Dr. Al-Arawi leads us to the Mustansariya school, built in the 13th century during the reign of the 37th Abbasid Caliph al-Mustansir Billah. There is something almost modern in its use of light and space with its long corridors, rounded corners, and high ceilings. Dr. Al-Arawi is proud of his country's heritage and reminds us that Iraq was the birthplace of architecture, as the first ark was designed and built by the Sumerians. After leaving this part of town, where residents live much as they did a century ago, with the possible exception of electricity when it's working and the occasional telephone line, we head towards Al-Mansur. The reality here is much more late 70s and 80s, when wide streets and neon signs illuminating clothing shops and restaurants. It's hard to say exactly where the 90s era of Baghdad is, as that decade kind of bypassed the city with weapons inspectors more accessible than the internet, and most of the population looked locked inside Iraq, But perhaps it would be Arasat al-Hindiye, where posh new restaurants serve weird versions of escalope à limon, stores full of smuggled perfumes and widescreen TVs beckon, new art galleries have sprung up, and the same CD of Julio Iglesias seems to play everywhere. And there really are only so many times you can hear his version of Bamboleo in 42-degree heat. It's just constant. Julio was well-loved, like Celine. On the way to El Mansur, we detour past the old racetrack, which is being torn down and replaced by a giant mosque. We also drive past a sports stadium. This is a picture I took at Al-Gailani Mosque 3 days after the bombing campaign in 1998 called Desert Fox, of a girl. So the old racetrack is being torn down to be replaced by a giant mosque. We also drive past a sports stadium designed by Le Corbusier in 1957, but never built until the early 80s. So we don't have a picture of the Le Corbusier Stadium, but it's online. You can find it. So it was never built. It was just designed in 1957, and then it was built in the early 80s. As we approach a fancy residential area of Al Mansur, we're surrounded by beggars at an intersection. This never happened before, says Dr. Al-Arawi tersely. With its impossibly wide lots, sprawling villas, and palm tree-lined streets, the neighborhood is strangely reminiscent of 70s American suburbia. This is the kind of place where the Brady Bunch would have lived if Mr. Brady had been transferred to Baghdad. It's also the neighborhood where CNN correspondent Jane Arraf is ensconced. It should be noted that despite CNN's rather superficial American TV version of Iraq, their status in Baghdadi society, according to a local wire service reporter, falls somewhere after the president and between the number 2 in command, Izzat Ibrahim, and the deputy prime minister, Tariq Aziz. In the neighborhood of the traditional elite, there are many recent additions built by embargo cats. We approach one villa built in pristine painted limestone and closely resembling a miniature White House. We hope to photograph it in all its glory, but we are unfortunately foiled by a deaf-mute security guard hosing down his master's BMW. No photos, he mimes, pointing to the camera. Our minder Kais, who acts as if we've happened upon some state secret or something, barks out a gruff, "Vámonos," and we are off. An embarrassed Dr. El-Arawi tries to explain, they don't like their villas to be photographed, he ventures, because they're afraid someone might steal the design. So here, this is also from the wallpaper article. I'm sure you recognize that monument to the unknown soldier. And the famous Bush's criminal mosaic that greeted people as they walked into the El Rashid, which was then removed when it was taken over by the Marines post-invasion. So at the same time that I wrote this article during the sanctions and Saddam era of late 90s Baghdad, there was also a thriving theater scene. And here's a grainy shot that I took of a play. I'm going to read you just a little bit from Dancing in the No-Fly Zone from the theater chapter. So this was not an image that was very popular in North American media when you talked about Iraq. This was not an image that was very forthcoming. Just as Hollywood films of the 30s provided relief from the Depression, a few hours of escapist comedy at the El Mansour Theater did wonders for the psyche. In fact, a night out in Baghdad was not as bleak as one might expect. Again, this is sort of 2000 era. Despite the intellectual and artistic brain drain that had seen so much talent leave the country, the vibrant state-funded cultural life Baghdad had enjoyed in the oil-rich 70s was slowly being revived. One of the very few positive consequences of the embargo was the fact that Baghdad was free from the usual pressures of globalization. With little internet access, hardly any contact with the outside world, high unemployment, and cheap rents, Baghdad was in many ways an ideal place for artists and writers. Unlike London today, Hassan, right? Well, not as high as, say, a doctor's salary, working actors could certainly survive on their average monthly earnings of 200,000 dinar, about 100 US, more than 10 times that of a government worker. In fact, the increased popularity of theater had even produced its own star system. Majid Nassim had been a clothing salesman before he became an actor. "I always knew that I wanted to act," the 40-something celebrity told me backstage before the show, "but I didn't get any chance. I didn't get my big chance until after the embargo." The ravages of the sanctions helped him out in another unexpected way. He got his big break when he was called up to fill in for an actor who had come down with dysentery. When asked who his biggest influences were, Nassim cited Egyptian actor Adel Imam, Laurel and Hardy, and Mr. Ben. Seeing my puzzled expression, he mimed driving around in a car and made huge clownish faces. "Oh, Mr. Bean," I said. Yes, Mr. Bean, very nice." Apparently, Rowan Atkinson's politically inoffensive and very physical comedy style was a big hit on Iraqi television, appearing regularly on Shabab TV, the station run by Uday Hussein, the president's son. It was time for the play to begin, and I was being ushered around by Sadiq Ali Shaheen, the actor you may remember who passed away a few years ago, God bless him. And Sadiq ushered me into the theater, built by the government in 1980, when the petrodollars were still flowing freely. As the curtain rose, The sounds of Iraqi pop music filled the stage, and the cast began with a rousing song and dance number, followed by the opening scene, set in a luxurious hotel, not unlike the monolithic Al Rashid. The plotline was an interesting mix of reality and fantasy. Two girls, encouraged by their status-seeking mother, dress up in their best outfits and hang out in the lobby of the hotel, hoping to attract the attention of a rich foreigner who will provide them with the finer things in life, as well as the basic necessities so sorely lacking in Baghdad: decent food, medicine, housing, and transportation. In a desperate scheme to improve her daughter's lot, the mother, played by well-known actress Amal Taha, enters into a trance and invokes a genie to help her find a Superman who will arrive on a white horse and carry them away to a palace in the sky. The genie arrives and the fun begins. Meanwhile, an attractive but dirt-poor young man lands on top of the hotel in a helicopter. Posing as an international wheeler-dealer, he enlists the help of his friend, a penniless musician played by Nassim, who pretends to be his associate. In one hilarious scene, he speaks on the telephone in gibberish, pretending to talk about petroleum and pharmaceutical deals in fictitious foreign languages. Although his portrayal was clearly over-the-top farce, it was not that far away from the reality of the year 2000, when hundreds of foreign businessmen hungry for post-embargo contracts had descended on Baghdad. Predictably, the two girls, posing as rich Baghdadis, meet and fall in love with the two pretenders. In the end, true identities are revealed, but love prevails. "It is better," says one of the girls in a deliberate poke at the much-loathed sanctions profiteers, "it is better to love a poor man who is honest than a rich one who is full of lies." What do you think? Yeah? I don't know. Yanni? What do you say? Yeah? Okay. Well, it depends how poor and how rich. By the end of the play, the mood, there was a Marilyn Monroe song about that. We'll get into that later. You know, he's your guy when stocks are high, but watch when they start to descend. Anyway, by the end of the play, the mood of the crowd was downright jubilant, and I, too, had temporarily abandoned the feelings of cynicism and despair I so often experienced in embargoed Baghdad. I was seeing life through rose-colored glasses, and that song from Singing in the Rain kept going through my head, "Make 'em laugh, make 'em laugh." Buoyed up by the energy of the pretender, I accepted Sadiq's gracious offer to take in the play next door at a theater originally built as a cinema. But after half an hour of a lackluster morality tale about an evil city con man who tries to fool a village, not to mention a rather unfortunate trip to the ladies' bathroom, I was plunged back into despair. Alas, the play was not engrossing enough to take my mind off the state of Baghdad's sewage system, and we left the theater somewhat deflated. Had to be good, the quality of theater, to take your mind off the sewage system. Dark thoughts were soon interrupted by a beautiful song. Sadiq had launched into one of the hits of Kulthum, who, despite Nasser's best efforts, was really the only person ever to succeed in uniting the Arab world. As we walked towards Sadiq's battered old Buick, my mood lifted. I forgot about the howling mongrels and sewage smells and giant crossed arms. I looked at the full moon and listened to the words of the song. As long as there were aging actors in cravats singing love songs in Baghdad, I thought, as long as people could still make comedy out of their strange and sad situation, maybe there was hope. This photo, by the way, was taken, Haider al-Monatter did a play called My Love is the Moon, and there were a lot of ways that the theater was able to criticize the regime in a way that the state-run press could not, through double meanings and layered language. And they would do things like, they would set plays in a different era. So this was the story of an Iraqi student who goes to a museum, and then he gets pulled into a time warp, and he goes back to the Ottoman times. And there is a bloated, corrupt, evil sultan. And there is a girl that has to be rescued. And this is a scene where the hero ends up in a circus in Istanbul. And I recount in my chapter on theater. And he has to dance in the circus. It's sort of this whole kind of theater of the absurd concept, which is the title of my chapter on Iraqi theater, which you can read. So I was going to show you some clips here. Oh yeah, okay. So actually, just sort of moving along, so this was 2000, and then in the post-invasion era, when I arrived in August of 2003, I met artists who were caught in a kind of limbo, just kind of watching and waiting to see what would happen. So I was going to show you a little clip. I went into post-invasion Baghdad with this little tiny camera. There we go. And I videotaped all my interviews. This is Isam Pasha being interviewed in his studio.
Artists haven't really explored any themes around the occupation or the invasion. I mean, Anna Kennedy from Canada. If the Americans invaded us 5 months ago, I'm pretty sure we would have some public outcry.
Can you hear?
On a cultural level, either painting or films or music that would be anti-American. Or so far, the only expression of anti-Americanism I've seen is so far bombing, but nothing on a cultural.
Can you hear at the back, Isan?
Why do you think that is?
First, because maybe you had no Saddam Hussein before the American arrived. That's one thing. The other thing is, I think the intellectuals here and the artists, they've been harmed by Saddam so much, other than other people. The worst thing for an artist is to keep him in a cage. He can do nothing. He cannot communicate with other foreign artists or participate out of Iraq. And lots of things were forbidden here. No supporting from the government, and you had to work, with the government sometimes, and you see the limits. So in the American here, the artists appreciate that they give them back their liberty. That's one thing. The other thing is, you should be, the intellectuals, they don't give their judges very soon, very fast. They should wait and watch and see what's happening and appreciate the situation, and then they're gonna present art.
Well, I haven't been to Sadr City. Maybe they have some anti-American murals or something. Or is there any?
Not done by artists.
No.
Maybe by.
Television viewers in the West may recall the horrific images of looting in April of 2003, the early days of the invasion, dismissed casually by Donald Rumsfeld with his infamous "stuff happens" remark. But for Iraqis such as Malala, whose beautiful scorched canvases seemed literally imprinted by the ongoing war, the destruction and looting of the Iraqi Museum was not just a national catastrophe, it was a grim foreshadowing of the cultural destruction to follow. I am going to light a fire in paradise and pour water onto hell, the 8th century Iraqi woman, poet, singer, and Sufi saint Rabia wrote, so that both veils may vanish altogether. As the fires of conflict engulf Iraq, I am reminded of this verse by Rabia. But the words of poets are cheap now, as traditional music is drowned out by the clamor of automatic weapons, bombs, and the divisive rhetoric of those who believe God is on their side. Rabia's words capture the essence of what it is to be an Iraqi artist today, caught between a battle for survival and the struggle to overcome the image of Iraq, the cradle of civilization, as an empty landscape of terror. While life under Saddam and sanctions was harsh, artists, writers, and performers found ways to survive. Despite hardships created by the embargo and the excesses of a police state, the theater scene thrived in the 90s, pushing the envelope politically with layered language and double meanings in a way the state-run press could not. Dozens of private galleries opened, and the stoic Iraqi National Symphony Orchestra played on, albeit with frayed violin strings and cracked oboe reeds. Now, thanks to the fatal combination of Islamist militias, criminal anarchy, and violent occupation, the culture that sustained Iraqis through hard times has broken down, perhaps irrevocably. The theaters and galleries that once helped make Baghdad a cultural and intellectual capital of the Arab world have closed. The Poets Cafe on Mutanabi Street, this is a picture I took in 2003 October, once the center of Iraq's literary scene, and where animated discussions on everyone from Mahfouz to Walt Whitman took place, has been bombed. And a de facto ban on live music has meant that even al-Maqam al-Iraqi is no longer heard, not even at weddings. So of course we know that this cafe later sprang back to life, and I got to visit it in 2010. The National Orchestra, which attempted a few furtive post-invasion concerts under armed guard, has been silenced, and many of Iraq's artists have joined the roughly 2 million other Iraqis who have fled death threats and chaos for life in exile. So it's quite a long article, and I know you're getting exhausted probably listening to all this, but artists in Iraq have always been a litmus test by which to measure the state of things. Even as oil companies and black marketeers prospered during the embargo years and artists were reduced to a stark choice between food and canvas, medicine and violin strings, they managed to hang on. Culture was a form of resistance to bombings, Saddam, and sanctions, and to the harsh circumstances of life for the 95% of Iraqi society that were not part of the Ba'athist elite or the president's inner circle. Physical infrastructure can always be rebuilt, but how do you rebuild a culture and society traumatized by decades of war, sanctions, oppression, and occupation? Indeed, what hope remains for a resurgence of Iraqi culture from the ashes of war and despair when its creative and intellectual resources have vanished? Sadly, the siege mentality that inspired Baghdadi artists in the 90s has been replaced by fear and chaos that inspire only profit-making in the booming security market. And most poignantly, with the voices of poets and players silenced, there is no one left to document the very death of a culture in Iraq. Those who have not been killed or exiled are doomed to have their fates articulated by sound bites of televised horror. The caricatured reduction of 27 million people to mini Saddams that once typified mainstream media portrayals of Iraqis before the invasion has been replaced by a terrible new cartoon. Iraqis as mad suicide bombers, magically transformed from secular to sectarian within a few years of occupation. The victims of the new terror are labeled as its perpetrators. So I go through quite a long description of going back to the theater after the invasion and talking to people and interviewing exiled poets here like Adnan al-Sayegh, who was threatened when he went back and was unable to read his poetry. I think you're all familiar with the fact that 400 academics were murdered after the invasion. And I even have an interview with Rashad Salim, who formed the International Network for Contemporary Iraqi Artists. So I'll just finish with a little bit more from Hala Malala, who says, "The new series she is working on consists of distressed tableau of green, black, and red that suggest a scorched Iraqi flag," image you saw earlier, "bloodied and battered, but still defiant. Now I am painting with the tools of destruction," she says. Her work uses old bullet casings, burned and blackened canvases, and surfaces slashed by knives in a way that is once visceral and violent, yet subtle and sensitive. Malala also creates large works on wireframe tissue that can be collapsed into a 7-centimeter cube, suitable for hasty smuggling out of war zones. So far, she says, my most successful work was from my exhibition in Amman in 2005. This is the fate of the Iraqi artist, to create under the very worst circumstances. And I also interviewed Sadi Youssef. I hope, is he still well? Is he alive and well? Sadi? Okay. So in this article, I included an excerpt from one of his best-known poems, which you may know, but I wanted to communicate to people that Iraq was a land of poets.
Still.
And is. Still. Getting to that. America, America. America, let us exchange your gifts. Take your smuggled cigarettes and give us potatoes. By the way, for those of us who aren't familiar with this poem, it was written when he was in exile in Damascus in 1995. America, let us exchange your gifts. Take your smuggled cigarettes and give us potatoes. Take James Bond's golden pistol and give us Marilyn Monroe's giggle. Take the heroin syringe under the tree and give us vaccines. Take your blueprints for model penitentiaries and give us village homes. By the way, in my book, there's a whole chapter on a PR tour that I took with Janice Karpinski of Abu Ghraib prison about 8 months before the scandal broke. Take the books of your missionaries and give us paper for poems to defame you. Take what you do not have and give us what we have. Take the stripes of your flag and give us the stars. Take the Afghani mujahideen's beard and give us Walt Whitman's beard filled with butterflies. Take Saddam Hussein and give us Abraham Lincoln, or give us no one. So here's a photo I took of some women dancing at a wedding right after the invasion. And in my book, you can read about what happens to Ahlam, who ran a beauty parlor. She was a war widow, and I used to go to her beauty parlor in Mansour, and it was like a refuge where I could meet with the women, and they told me how much it cost to feed their children, how much it cost to buy eggs at the market, how unsafe it was to take their children to school. I got sort of the real story. So this is a photo I really love because you can see the mother watching her daughter. This was just in September 2003, and there was sort of this sense of freedom and possibility that was horribly betrayed. And there we have more of Hana Malala, sorry. And this, of course, is that famous photo down America that I took in 2000 at the elementary school. So this is a very interesting map. We were talking about maps earlier, maps of ancient sites. And this is a map that was developed by Michael Izzadi for Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. So this shows kind of a map of Baghdad in 2003. And I don't know if you can read the guide there, but basically the green is the Shia majority, and the red is the Sunni, and the blue is the Christian, and then the yellow color is mixed. So as you know, Baghdad was a very cosmopolitan city. And then he shows how the sectarianism really became a reality in terms of the physical landscape and walled-off neighborhoods from 2006 until 2007. So I was just going to read you a little dispatch from when I went back in 2010 for New Internationalist. And this is Haidar Dafar, who you may know. I think, Hassan, you know Haidar, yeah. And he's an interesting filmmaker. And I was driving across Baghdad with him. He says, "There is freedom here now," this is in 2010, smiles Haidar Dafar, a bad boy Iraqi filmmaker whose documentary Dream of Sparrows recounts the chaos and tragedy of post-invasion Iraq. Freedom of expression and freedom to kill. In his late 30s, Haidar is the kind of guy who likes to make provocative political statements, punctuated by recently acquired English cuss words, drags of his Camel cigarettes, and melancholic glances. He is currently working on a script about a journalist who finds himself trapped in a morgue, but he supports himself by making commercials for the likes of Iraqi mobile phone companies. As we drive through Baghdad's toxic traffic, it can now take up to 2 hours to cross town. If you don't die of exhaust inhalation en route, he tells me. He tells me his story. "I was threatened by a Sunni militia," explains the nominally Shia yet agnostic filmmaker, "via my wife, who is Sunni and works in a government office. Shortly after, he received a death threat from a Shia militia, apparently offended by reference in his film to Baghdad's enthusiastic, if somewhat underground, drinking culture, and he had to flee. But that was back in the bad old days of sectarian militia terror, which, depending on who you ask, lasted anywhere from 2004 until very recently, although most agree that 2006 and 2007 were the worst years, and that Maliki's security initiative military crackdown did sort of help a little bit. But at an old Ottoman villa on the banks of the Tigris, once inhabited by Gertrude Bell and recently converted to a theater, I encounter a parallel world. And that is me in a parallel world in 2010. Here, a group of young actors and dancers rehearse for a new play about Iraqi poet Mudaffar al-Nawab, the communist writer imprisoned by Saddam, who now makes strident statements against both American occupation and the Iraqi government from his home in Syria. Their choreography is a mix of Twyla Tharp breakdancing and Iraqi chobi. Their enthusiasm and the general air of liberation compel me to put down my notebook and, with their encouragement, jump right into their dance. Got to dance with them, it was great. Later, they tell me their stories. A 21-year-old from a poor Shia neighborhood reveals that he was threatened by Mehdi militiamen a few years ago for having long hair and being an actor, but that now the situation has improved. Remember, this is 2010. One of his colleagues, a 16-year-old named Ali from the same neighborhood who does a mean moonwalk, tells me that his father was killed by Saddam for belonging to the Dawah party. Ali says his two brothers are quite religious and disapprove of his theater work, but his mother is very proud of him and comes to all his performances. But Ali would never give this up. When I dance, he tells me, I feel like I'm flying and I forget about the difficulties of life here. Okay. Starring in the play is al-Nawab's mother, Bushra Ismail, a veteran of the Iraqi theater scene who recently won the award for Best Actress in the Arab world. Under Saddam, we suffered from censorship, she recounts, but now it's the religious parties we have to be careful about offending. There's a whole new set of red lines that we can't cross. Still, everyone is excited about their opening night at the National Theatre, which began evening performances again after a long post-invasion period of security-minded daytime ones at the end of 2008. So there's Bushra. Theater manager Nabil Tahir tells me that though there's still insufficient arts funding from the government, he feels hopeful about the future of Iraqi culture. We feel much freer than before, he says, despite the fact that the theater was damaged by a bomb in 2008. He cites a recent political satire by Iraqi playwright-director Haidar Manater that lampooned then head of parliament Mahmoud al-Mashhadani. He sent the actors flowers and a congratulatory card, he explains, noting that this would have been unimaginable a decade ago. There's the man guarding the theater. Another precedent was set, he recounts, when, in a rather unfortunate coincidence, a celebration of International Theater Day took place at the same time as a huge anti-occupation demonstration led by Muqtada al-Sadr, right across the street from the National Theater. Some militiamen crossed over and threatened to hang us from a pole unless we stopped our celebration. But I tried to reason with them, saying, look, we're just artists, not politicians, and we're all Iraqis after all. The end result was a National Theatre-sponsored play about the life of Imam Hussein, produced on location in Sadr City with a mix of professionals and local amateurs, including a few militiamen. One of them, explains Tahir, became so enamored of the theater that he actually left his militia to become a professional actor. But you can't interview him, he cautions, because he doesn't like to dwell on his past. So we're going to have some oud music by Isan Al-Imam, a wonderful oud player. And thank you for coming. And if you have any questions, I guess you can just talk to me later.
Thank you.